Hi everyone, I'm Kadambari Sahu. I'm the head of design at ValueLabs. Design Inspire is a web series of passionate, innovative, and young inspiring designers. The web series dive into their passion, inspiration, and what makes them go. It's an effort to understand how they are navigating their career path and how they are investing their creative energies. We believe hearing their bold moves and inspiring stories will ignite interest and inspire the next generation of budding designers across the globe. So let's go forward. Our guest today, Mansi. Mansi, can you tell a little bit about yourself?
A little bit about myself. I started off my design journey by studying graphic design in Symbiosis in Pune. And then I worked in a bunch of like advertising firms and design agencies for a little while. And then I went to NID to study new media, where I met Kadambari. And after that, I worked in another digital design agency and then happened to go meander over to Adobe, where I worked on the Document Cloud and Acrobat team, and worked there for about 4.5 years as an interaction designer. And yeah, just in March of 2018, I moved to Google UK, and I work on the Android platform design team here. So that's a little bit of a short summary of where I'm coming from. So in today's topic, like when I said navigating a world in flux, a designer's toolkit, these are the kind of images that will pop into your mind when I say tools. And I have nothing against them. Like, I mean, I use a lot of these every day in my day-to-day work as well. But I'd rather not talk about these tools today. I'd rather talk about like certain amount of mindsets, behaviors, and some of these thoughts that we should keep in our mind so that we are equipped for like a new era of interaction design, which are a little bit more conceptually relevant. And I'll draw from my own experience wherever I can. These kind of like behaviors and mindsets have helped me in my career. So hopefully it's a little bit personal. And also that the lens is a little bit different for these behaviors. So I'm just going to jump right into it. So I mean, I know I can't see anybody right now, but I would love to do like some sort of a poll about how many of us would have imagined, like, 5 to 10 years ago, that we would be designing for things like voice interfaces or VR or AR or even like, tech that is powered by AI or ML. And I think, I mean, I'm pretty sure most of us would say that we didn't know that and we couldn't have predicted it. And so this is just like a background of how our practice is going through like a little bit of a sea change, and all of these issues that are coming up with new technologies are something that we need to keep in mind. And some of these toolkits that I'll talk about are going to be helpful in that sort of scenario. So I have like these five things that I want to talk about. And the first one is something that I know a lot of people who know me know that I love books. And I think all of us should be like sort of like a sponge, especially like designers who want to learn about everything around them in the world, like go to like museums and like go to travel and like meet people and read books. So there's a case for staying curious. And why that is because there's like new problems that we're dealing with now. So imagine that you're working for like a company that's making a self-driving car, and that might be true for some people within my company. I haven't directly interacted with any of them, but the kind of problems that you'll deal with are going to go beyond just like what kind of button will drive conversions and things like that. They're going to be a little bit more like ethically driven, more morally loaded questions. Like, for instance, if you design a car that is a self-driving car, should you prioritize the occupant of the car versus the pedestrian who's crossing the road? If like you see in the image, if there's a choice for the car to swerve towards an older person versus a baby, which direction would the car choose? So this sort of thing was built by the MIT researchers called the Moral Machine a few years back, and the results of this are super interesting because they kind of make you think about like the trolley problem from philosophy, and how can we draw from those kind of naughty and sort of very ethically loaded questions, and how can we inform that into our practice. So our work today, like especially I know for my own thing, is doesn't have like a direct impact, for instance, on life and death like this would be. But I think we should start like arming ourselves with knowledge from like other fields, like say philosophy and psychology, law, linguistics, sociology, all of that, so that we can, when the time comes for us to deal with problems like this, we are well equipped. So that is the case for being like a T-shaped designer. And this is something that I'm sure a lot of you would have come across before, because this is something that Tim Brown said, Tim Brown from IDEO said back in 2010, that you need to have a certain breadth of knowledge, even if you choose like a certain 2 or 3 core areas for your expertise, you still need to create something or where a huge knowledge base where you can draw from your own experiences and so on, to create like some sort of a larger picture. And the case for that, just as an example, is how the iPod came into being. And like the iPod is a story that is sort of done to that death, but it's important because I don't know how many of us know that it's not like it was imagined as like this revolutionary product that came out and everybody loved it. But at the end of the day, it had a lot of things that were already existing in the market at the time. So it was not the first portable music player in the market. They were already existing. The core problem that they solved was of storage. So what they did was there was a storage, like a portable storage, that was already been built by Toshiba, so which is the first image on the left-hand side. And what they did was they took that and then they put it in like a smaller form factor. And then they kind of took the design and the inspiration of the design and the industrial design from like Dieter Rams' radio back in the 1950s. And then even the name iPod came from like the copywriter referencing a dialogue from 2001: A Space Odyssey, where there's this character Hal, which is the AI, and he says, and the narrator says that open the pod bay doors, Hal, and the sort of AI refuses, and that's the first thing that they came up with, like when they saw the device. So even the name came from like previous existing like references. So this like the breadth of knowledge of hardware, mechanical design, industrial design, everything came together to kind of make the iPod. And it wasn't just like there wasn't an idea or like a eureka moment that helped it to come into being. So this breadth from drawing from to create something is something that's important. The other flip side that I want to point towards is when we say reading, we need to be careful about what we are reading, because online, as we know, that reading anything or getting like any information is like a little bit of a dopamine kick. And I think everybody out there who's creating content online knows that. And this whole idea of short form, like very quick, bite-sized content is something that is proliferated so much online these days. And it's those quick like dopamine shots that our brain gets. And we don't end up reading like for a very long time, or we don't end up reading something like complex ideas or like longer term, longer form reading. So there's a book, especially by this author called Sven Burkitz, called The Gutenberg Elegies, where he says that the like deep reading of this kind for long form text requires like deep concentration and enhances like your ability to critically examine a text and analyze a complex subject. And this can only happen if you stop like reading this kind of infinitely scrolling feed kind of stuff that's clickbait that's all over online. So you need to be a little bit careful about what you consider reading and staying curious for. And I want to end this section by saying that there's a really famous quote by a 1950s Madison Avenue ad man called Carl Alley, and he says that the creative person wants to be a know-it-all, and he or she want to know about all kinds of things, ancient history, 19th century mathematics, manufacturing techniques, and hawk futures, because you don't know where these ideas might come from together to form like a new idea. So that, in a nutshell, is what I'm trying to say. And when you say you want to be a better designer, you should be curious about everything and or everything in the world around you, not just like design and interaction design and like design books, for instance. All right, moving on. The second bit is like how we can use imagination to create future fictions. So these are a few of pop culture references and books that that have rocketed into like in the forefront in the recent past, because we've started to see like the things that they said are somewhat coming true. So 1984 is a book by George Orwell. Brave New World is a book by Aldous Huxley. WALL-E's a movie. I'm sure you pretty much know about it and must have seen it. And Black Mirror is, of course, something that is always in the news for like imagining dystopian futures. The exercise of like world building like this is a very valuable tool, because it's not just the thing itself, but the whole narrative around it, and how the people and their behaviors and economies and societies change on the basis of these new technologies that come about. And I think that's super important. And what these specific 4 pop culture references, if I might say, predicted was like, say, 1984 was all about surveillance. And I'm sure like things happening right now in Hong Kong and like a lot of places even across the world, and maybe even in India, are kind of pointing towards what can happen if citizens are surveilled all the time. Social media and the kind of instant gratification that you get, or the validation that you keep looking for online, was something that was predicted by Huxley. E-waste and WALL-E, and maybe just like all of the different kind of dystopian futures that can happen with all technologies like robotics and social media and so on. Black Mirror treats like all of them in like their different episodes. So if you haven't watched it, I'll really recommend it. I mean, we have time at home these days, so it would be a good watch. So like the practice of thinking about these kind of futures is called design fictions, and it's a term that was popularized by futurist Julian Baker. And I think it's a really important tool in our arsenal to sort of paint pictures of the future and have visions which are functional. And there's another kind, like on the other side, there's another kind of future making that's possible, and I want to talk about the Memex here, which in 1945 was imagined by Vannevar Bush, and he wrote an essay called As We May Think, and he envisioned the Memex as a device in which individuals could compress and store all sorts of books and records and communications, and it would be mechanized so that you could consult it with amazing speed and alacrity. So within this desk, there would be like cameras and electromechanic like fittings and such that would reference like any sort of information that you want at any time, and you would get it like with the snap of your fingers. So that sounds really familiar to us right now, because we have like stuff like Wikipedia at our fingertips, or even Google search. But back in the day, this stuff didn't exist, of course. It's in the 1940s. But even though it wasn't exactly the form that eventually ended up with the World Wide Web, it did predict a lot of these technologies back in that day, like hypertext or like online encyclopedias and so on, and speech recognition. So even if the thing that you imagine as an object won't eventually be productionized, so to speak, in the same manner, this way of future making and visions and thinking of coming up with new ideas is really useful. Maybe if not for you, but maybe for somebody who's coming down the line in the next generation, and they can take that idea and build upon it. And this reminds me of an exhibition that I went to recently in 2019 called Moving to Mars at the Design Museum here in London. And it was based on the premise that what would it take for us to move to Mars, and all of the sort of trappings with that, like how would we travel there, like what kind of structures would be built to live there? Like, what would your garments be like? How would you grow food for sustenance and so on? And everything, like from tracing the history of like what we think of moving to Mars and the scientific bits of it were kind of collated into the exhibition. And it was super interesting for me to see and trace that. But I also ended up thinking about it, like, such an exercise like the exhibit mentioned, they do allow us to move forward, and some of the technologies that they're experimenting with will potentially help like even life on Earth. But when you start thinking about like futures like this of space and places where there hasn't been like borders drawn, or like, nobody knows who owns it, so to speak, we need to consider like some of these really important questions, like who is it that gets to go to Mars to create like some sort of a parallel civilization, and what processes would decide who gets to go to Mars, and are those processes fair? Will they have the same kind of, the society that we build there, will it kind of have the same kind of biases that we have here? Does like painting this sort of a vision result in like a cynical sort of a hopelessness for like, okay, let's let this planet go to like not let's not solve the problems here because we have another option. So that those are some of the things that we need to question when we need to look at futures as well, and who are these futures for, because we don't want to carry the same sort of privilege and biases across to other places and other projects. And to conclude this section, I would like to say that it's good to come up with like these grand ideas and visions. It's also really important to take like an ecosystem approach to it. And authors like Donella Meadows have elaborated on how systems thinking requires like a shift in mindset. So if you need to start thinking about like the networks that involve all ecosystems and not the individual nodes. Your thinking needs to be a little bit more cyclical rather than it being very linear. And instead of designing for, say, isolated users, we need to start thinking about like how do we design for the relationships between them and the relationships with their environment and the impact that kind of has. So this particular project of the image that you see in the background is a project, I don't know if a lot of you would have seen it or not, but it's super interesting, and I'd recommend for you to go and check it out. It's called The Anatomy of an AI System, and it tracks like the life of an Alexa query from like the software layer down to like the silicon layer, which is and where the silicon comes from, being mined in Africa and so on, and all of the actors and all the people who are involved in just like that one single thing, which we tend to not look at when we design like interfaces and such. We look at like the software layer of it maybe, and then you stop there. But we need to go a little bit deeper and start thinking about like ecosystems in general. So if you haven't seen it, I'd encourage you to check it out. And this vision making should encompass sort of systems thinking in it as well. So visions are important, and it's important for us to chalk out time outside of like release cycles to give some time to think about the future. And the way to think about the future is to include all sorts of actors in them. And visions, like this is Brett Victor from Why Dream, which is again like a super amazing resource. Would encourage you to check it out. And visions give people a direction and inspire to act. And a group of inspired people is the most powerful force in the world. So even if there are things that you imagine that would not come to be right this moment, it's important to leave certain things for posterity. All right, now comes the like little bit of the fun part. This is the reason why we got into design in the first place. Everybody who I've ever met in the design community has said that they had like some sort of a passion for like making things and building things, or tinkering or playing, and that might be anything. Like it might be like you like to paint, or you like to build your own blocks, or you were really into fashion, or you were really into say tinkering with electronics or whatever it is. But this is the reason that why we got into design. And I feel like some of the times that our day-to-day jobs kind of forget, like in our day-to-day jobs, we forget that this is where we came from. So getting our hands dirty is important, and we should take a time out to do that as well, because it nurtures that little creative side of our personality, which sometimes might not get as much of an outlet in our day-to-day jobs. So with interaction design specifically, there are these new tools that are available to us, like whether they're things like the Arduino or microcontrollers, very easy to pick up code platforms like processing, or like if you want to experiment with 3D printing these days, it's super easy. It's important to play with these tools and new materials because the older materials that we used to play with, like are, while they gave us a good base, this will give us some sort of a good base for us to understand how technology is going to evolve and how we're going to help it, how we can help shape it for the future. So there's another particular book by an author called David Rose called Enchanted Objects, which paints a picture of like how technology can explode out of the screens and become situated in the living environment. And when we start thinking about things like that, if you tinker with these kind of tools, you'll be able to imagine and create those scenarios with a little bit more flexibility and adeptness. So, and this is where I come to the point where we have to nurture that maker inside of us. I know there's a lot of time, like I know it happens to me, where there's like days and days of, chock-a-block full of meetings and like bug fixes and such, and you're not like really getting your hands dirty and making anything. But one of the designers, Matt Jones, who now works at Google, but he used to own a design agency called Berg in London, which created things like the little printer and lots of like little objects which imagined how different futures can be. He in a recent talk said like chatting is cheating. So if you cannot, you shouldn't aim to explain your idea through words. You should use like other tools in your arsenal to kind of paint a picture of what it looks like. And I mean, you can literally paint a picture, but you can also use like a lot of other things which I've already spoken about as tools to kind of enable you to do that. And it's important for us to do that and to take the time to immerse ourselves in something new and creating something with our hands, because there's a concept of flow. And when you immerse yourself in something that is just the right amount of difficult and just the right amount of something that interests you, you enter a state which we know now as flow, and it helps you to sort of disconnect from the day-to-day complexities of your job maybe. And side projects are amazing for this. So I would encourage everyone to have like some sort of a side project that they nurture on their own outside of their regular job requirements. So flip side, I end each section almost with like a flip side. Flip side to this is like, especially now, I would encourage people to not feel like they need to be productive all the time. I know that the pandemic is like, as soon as the pandemic sort of started spreading, I've also seen like a spike in the number of ads that you see for like online courses and things like that. And it's almost like you're getting time at home, so you should, at the end of whatever 6 months, I don't know how long it's going to be, a year or something, you should come out with like, having learned like 6 languages, or like learned how to code and learned how to like do all sorts of things. But it's important to take care of yourself and not consider everything to be towards an end goal. So the thing is that like we live in like this sort of neoliberal post-capitalist society where everything has to have some sort of a value, and the kind of value that we attach to hobbies isn't that great. But we need to think about our time on this planet as not just being something that contributes to value in the traditional sense, in the economic sense of it, but something that is just to nurture ourselves. So if you want to, if you feel like baking, or if you feel like doing something which is not directly related to your job or supposed to make you like a better designer, so to speak, you should go ahead and do that. And you shouldn't feel like, yes, I should pick up a hobby that's going to help in my job as well. So there's some sort of a balance that needs to be drawn on both those ends. All right, I think any talk of design these days wouldn't be sort of complete without talking about empathy and connecting with people. And if you sort of do like a Google search, I think you'll see so many articles and so many like periodicals and things that are coming out with just how you can use empathy in like the UX design process. And it's almost become like a step in the design process. Like, yes, we will do empathy in the first step of the process and then kind of like take it from there. It's, for me personally, to whittle something like empathy down to like just a step in the process is not giving it enough due credit. It should almost be like an ideology, something that is the basis of all of our work. It should be something that guides all of our actions, not just at work, but even outside of it, because it's not like a switch you can flip, right? I'm going to be empathetic towards my users at work, and I'm going to be like extremely mean and rude and whatever to people outside of it. So it's almost like something that you need to be and do in all of the aspects of your life, rather than just like being a designer and saying that, yes, this is the step of design thinking empathy that I should complete. And as an example, like VR has been touted as the ultimate empathy tool, because you can wear a headset and kind of get inside somebody else's visions of what their life are like. And these are a few examples. Like Across the Line is a VR documentary film where you get inside the body of a pregnant woman who's going to an abortion clinic, and she's being harassed by anti-abortion like protesters. And then the other one, the screenshot from the right, is from a VR film that talks about like what it's like to be abused as a child in a family that is dysfunctional. So it's like films like these will create a sort of personal distress when you watch them, but there is a difference between personal distress and empathic concern. And this is something that researchers have found, that they did like a study even right before VR, that they took blindfolds and they put it in front of users, and they bound their hands, and they're like, go about your day like this, to try to understand how blind people live. But and of course, like the users who did have sight, they struggled. But the thing is, blind people do not struggle like that on a day-to-day basis. They don't require like warmth from us. They want like respect, and they want like understanding. So basically the idea that for us to grant some sort of legitimacy onto somebody's problems or somebody's distress, we need to experience it ourselves. That's just a little bit flawed, because you shouldn't have to experience things yourselves for you to be able to feel empathy, or for you to be able to feel like you need to do things to optimize for all of these kind of people outside of it as well. So this is a really, really cool quote that I found, that if you won't believe somebody's pain unless they wrap you in an expensive 360-degree video around you, then perhaps you don't really care about their pain. So it's important to not use empathy as just like a tool and or a step in the process, or something that I take upon myself or my own body, but it needs to be empathic concern. So I'd encourage you to read a little bit more about that if you're interested. And leading up to that, I think personal experiences that this sort of individuality of anybody can only be respected when we are also really self-aware and we practice reflection. And this goes back to a little bit to our ethnography project back in NID, where we were asked to write autobiographies of ourselves, and we were like, well, how is that relevant? But thinking back, it's relevant because we were asked to be super detailed, and the idea was that we will become a little bit more aware of our own biases and privileges, and to situate ourselves in the context of who we are, and then that makes us better equipped to go out into the world and do things for other people. So to put your work in perspective, you need to understand your own privilege, be that on the basis of whatever it is, like whether it's on the basis of gender, race, caste, socioeconomic status, class, and the power that you have as a person of access. So self-awareness and empathy are very closely connected. So I think we should take the time out to become self-aware and the kind of biases that we have. And the last step is something that also I have learned over time, something that I didn't realize when I was just out of design school, was that, you come out of design school and you think that you're going to change the world and you're going to do, things that'll have like massive impact and, get published in papers and things like that. But we need to realize that big impact changes take a lot of time, and they should take time because they should be carefully considered. You should have multiple perspectives and people on board who ratify what you think is the right thing to do. And so that is why persistence and design is something that goes hand in hand, and design is always like a little bit in progress. And I think one of the sources of inspiration for me in the recent past, especially, has been nature itself. And you think about how long it takes for something like so immaterial like wind to create like these kind of landforms and caves. It becomes we should kind of imbibe that process and keep chipping away at the block till the time that we can shape it to whatever we want. We can't be impatient with something like that. And this kind of iterative design ability is something that we can really learn from nature. And this is just one example, but processes in nature are generally like slower, and they keep happening over many, many, many thousands of years. And just taking a look at that and being humbled by that, and situating your own life and the time of your own life and the kind of work that you do in the context of that helps you be a little bit more persistent. So as my work on the Android team evolves, it's not been a very long time since I joined the team, but there's been a lot of history and the little quirks and anecdotes that I've heard about how the platform has evolved for the past 10 years. And it simply fascinates me because it's sort of democratized like smartphones and computing for so many people, like more than 2 billion people around the world. And the fact that it's open source, and that the fact that people can put their own spin on it, and like device manufacturers can customize it and people can customize it, is something that is close to my heart. And I think it's the way that computing should be pushed forward. But I also believe now, and in the past, like about 2 years, I've realized that it's still so much to do. And as we move forward and society moves forward, we still figure out like the things that we did in the past, we have corrections to make of them. Sometimes it's not new features, but features that we have to kill that take a lot of time to figure out and to design around, because all design is not just about like creating new things, it's also about like saying goodbye to things that are no longer relevant. So yeah, I mean, this is just like a small snippet of how things have evolved in Android over the past, and maybe the GIF will give you a little bit of an idea, but this is sort of the evolution of just a very small aspect, visual aspect of the platform, of how the launcher and the app screen have and the navigation at the bottom has evolved back from Gingerbread to Android 10, which released in 2019. So back from like not having touch screens at all to now having like complete gesture-driven navigation and patterns. It's been like such a huge sort of evolutionary step, and like everything happens because like we decide to change it little by little over multiple years. So it's been more than 10 years that the platform has been around. So I get, and it's like when you work on projects and products like that, you have to put your work sort of in context and be like, yeah, you know, whatever you make will not ship tomorrow or be available to people tomorrow, but it's something that you have to keep persisting at. So those are the 5 things that I wanted to talk about. I know I took a little bit extra time than I was told, but hopefully that was useful. And thanks for listening. And happy to take questions now.
Thank you, Manasi, for such an interesting talk. I really loved the designer's toolkit that you talked today about. And the next question is, my team has come up with a lot of questions that they want to ask you. So I've compiled it and I'm going to ask you one by one. So that's the second question that second round that we have. So we'll start with something which is very simple, or questions that we always ask for ourselves. Like, so for you, what does being designer mean to you?
Being a designer to me means that I'm the representative of the people who are going to be using a product or service in the room where it is being built. So while I know it's not like a democratically elected representative process, but I would imagine that you should consider yourself as one who is going to be the voice of users and voice of people who are going to be using anything, all of your products, not just the current users, but even future generations in the room, and kind of take the responsibility of figuring out what is the best thing to do for everyone in an equitable and fair fashion. So yeah, that's I think what I feel like in a nutshell our role should be.
So what inspires you as a designer?
Well, I think solving like problems for people, putting the access of technology in the hands of people that can change their lives in a positive way. Basically leaving the world a little bit better than the way you found it, through making people's lives a little bit easier. Because you know, we all know like everybody has like harder lives, and through whatever means, if we can help people out through like saving time, or like, you know, whatever, giving them access to certain things, making connections, helping nurture relations. So whatever it is that you're working on, we can make their lives a little bit better. I think that quest inspires me.
So design is always iterative, right? And there are failures in between as we go, you know, look into our designs, we find faults. So how do you deal with such failures?
Yeah, I mean, you have to deal with failures with a little bit of aplomb, in the sense that certain decisions, even if we do all of that stuff that I spoke about, like we imagine futures and we think how this design might age, sometimes you will make mistakes. Like the thing that comes to my mind is like, say, one of the designers who or a product people who came up with infinite scrolling back in the day. They came back and said, you know, that was one of the things that they wish they wouldn't have designed that way, because you know, infinite scrolling kind of tends to suck you in, right? Like, and you don't know where you are, and you can spend like hours you know, wasting potentially like time that you could spend maybe with your family or such. So it was made, something like that was made because the metric to measure success was wrong. It was like, oh, time spent, or like daily active user, or something like that. So I mean, those are the failures that I would want to watch out for or like to avoid. I mean, obviously, at the end of the day, we have to be careful that we live in like a sort of capitalistic world. So of course, there has to be some sort of a monetary value attached to these things at the end of the day. But we have to be careful, especially as UX designers. We have to somehow try to find a balance between failures like that'll not age well, like say infinite scrolling.
What about negative feedbacks or feedbacks which are not so positive? How one as a designer should take that, and what are the benefits that you think of feedback?
Feedback is super important because, right, like at the end of the day, if you feel like you know everything and you are the one whose opinion is the one that should be always taken and said, that's not right. I think I kind of try to adhere with strong opinions, loosely held. So you should have, yes, a strong opinion about what the best thing for the user is. But if somebody wants to give you feedback about how this might pan out not in the most optimal way, then you should be able to listen to it and optimize it on the basis of that as well. So feedback is important, like from your designers, but also from people who like your product managers, your engineers, your stakeholders, because they are experts in their field just like you are in yours. So when you create or build anything, you need experts in all fields to sort of come together.
What are your thoughts on collaboration within the project? And do you think what can collaboration do in terms of, when there are people with different opinions when they come together? So what do you think, how should you move ahead?
Yeah, I mean, that's tricky, right? Like, there'll always be people who will not see maybe the thing that you're trying to show in the same light. I always feel like you shouldn't shut that conversation down. You'll be like, okay, let's explore that. We'll come back to you with that. Let's see. And that's our superpower. So you can build something and say that, okay, this is the way this will pan out, like you suggested. But then you can also point out like, but this is where I think this will go wrong, or this is the concern with this. And the thing is, sometimes people also think it might look good in their own head, but they can't visualize things the way that we can. So I think we should use our superpower to kind of put things, even ideas that we don't agree with, maybe initially to a little bit of a form, and then say that these are the ideas that you're saying, but this will not work for XYZ reasons. Also, I think leaning towards like precedents or leaning towards like existing products or existing things which have done well, which you like, is something that you can use as tools to kind of convince people to collaborate and come to the same sort of yeah.
What about discourses and debate? How important do you think the role they play in designers' life?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you should definitely be having debates about what the right thing to do is, or and not just about design, right? Like you should be having debates about like larger things, or how do we situate our practice or technology in the current world and how it will impact the planet or like the people in it or the future generations and such. So having a level of debate about that with converging, sort of conflicting rather viewpoints is enlightening, because you get to see like different perspectives, and there's all sorts of people in the world, right? Like there hold all sorts of different viewpoints. So when you come across viewpoints that are not like your own, you know that they are also the kind of people that you are also designing for. So they also need to be brought into the fold, right? So and the discourse like has to be a little bit more deeper level and not just specific to like say whatever interface that you're building, but like why you're building it, or who is it for, and is it accessible to everyone, or how equal is the access to it, and so on.
Critical thought is very important in design, right? And I think debates generally help us to see that. So what would you recommend for young designers? How should they, hone their critical thinking skills?
Oh, wow. I don't know if I have like a magic bullet or something for that. But I think some of the things that, like I mentioned in the presentation, just like keep reading about different things around you, and read about like specific, especially stuff like law, or how an argument is made, or what are the pros and cons of an argument, things like that, or like even anthropology or sociology or things like that, where you learn what are the histories of people and how have they evolved, and what are the thoughts and what are the structures of societies and economies and things like that. I think you can critically evaluate something only when you see it in connection with other things. So to see those connections, you need to know a little bit more around the world around you. So I guess I would just say, like, read more widely, diverse things. Yeah, I guess.
I really like in your talk that you talked about that now, specifically in the time of the pandemic, people are trying to be super productive, right? And then there's this
Right.
work-life balance that we, really talk about. So how do you manage
Right.
that? And how is your, what is the day in life of Manasi Agarwal like?
Yeah, I mean, now, like, it kind of goes by a little bit of a blur. And I was reading a very article about like how our time perception has become warped in these times, because there's no like keystones or milestones that we kind of gauge against, and all days like sort of bleed into each other. And you're at home and you're working, so you just get up from your desk and you can come back to your desk even if it's like 8 o'clock in the evening. There's nobody stopping you. The computer is also still there. So I try to switch off at like 6 o'clock. Of course, sometimes that doesn't happen, because especially I work with remote teams, and that's when Bay Area teams wake up and things like that. So I try to switch off work by 6 p.m. But of course, these days it's just like, I get up in the morning, breakfast, lots of work, and then like, of course, you have to cook your own lunch and do that, and then all of the housework is sort of like rolled into the day as well. And that's I think people are like handling that. Everybody's out there is handling that in their own ways. So yeah, I mean, my meetings tend to go a little bit towards the latter part of the evening, because of the fact that we work with like Bay Area teams as well. So yeah, I would encourage for those who are not working with remote teams to have like hard stops at whatever time you want, and then like do other stuff, watch something, or read something, or make something, like yeah, weekends are good. Like weekends I use to paint and read, which is nice.
You also bake, right? So what do you currently
Yes.
bake?
Oh yeah, like I mean, I've been trying to bake healthier, because of course, like I like eating that kind of sweet stuff, but I know that of course that it's not that good for you. So how can you like kind of tailor baking into being a little bit more healthy? So like I'll swap out like refined flour for whole flour, or like stuff like substitute sugar for like honey or like jaggery or something like that, and do those experiments and see how it pans out. So I've been doing like lots of like muffins and cakes, and I did try bread. I mean, that's the thing to do in the pandemic, right? Like people are baking bread. So yeah. So we've tried a bunch of few things. I mean, I think people are getting in touch with their inner cooks in the pandemic as well.
And you read a lot. So what are you currently reading?
Currently, I'm reading a book called The Gene by Siddharth Mukherjee. It traces like how natural histories and how the science of hereditary came about. So it's super interesting, because I mean, I've just read like I think about 50 pages of it, but it's one of those science books that's written really like in a sort of approachable fashion for you to read. So I think stuff like that is interesting. That's one I'm reading, and the other one that I'm reading is Factfulness by Hans Rosling, which is also a really nice book, because it says, the world is not as bad as we think it is. It's been moving sort of in the right direction. There's less people in poverty than say 50 to 100 years ago. People have more access to clean water and food than say 50 or 100 years ago. There's less disease, mortality rates are low and stuff. So he's making the argument that yes, while day-to-day events, I don't know if the book would still like survive this, would survive the 2020 test, but yeah, it's still a little bit positive and hopeful. So I guess it's helping me cope.
Talking about inspiration, who are your designers that you look up to, inspiring designers, if I would say?
Oh, wow. Yeah. Inspiring designers. I mean, there's lots of people within the company in Google that I look up to specifically. Of course, there's Matt Jones back from the times of Berg, not before he even came to Google. There's the head of the Google Creative Lab, T. Uglo, and she's pretty amazing of like how to intersperse like technology with delight and not make all things like useful per se, and like play around a little bit, intersperse sort of a little bit more poetic and sort of artistic views of technology into one place. So she's pretty amazing. Matthias, of course, for Matthias Duarte, of course, for like material design and everything that happened in Android back in L. And a lot of people outside the company. I mean, there's so many. It's slipping my mind, but people are doing amazing work all across the world in like different fields and aspects. So it's difficult for me to pick some one particular designer. But I think some think tanks are like doing really good work, of course. So yeah, I don't know if other names are not springing to mind. Sorry.
I think that's okay. That's fine. We just wanted to know, like, really what inspires you. So that's why I talked about, books and people, and what gets you going, which is actually the topic of design inspire, right? So that's why I was looking at. You also like briefly when we spoke in Milan, you also told me that one thing that you really like is not just looking at design, but looking at other domains as well. Broadening your your arsenal with different thought processes.
Right.
So I would just say like what would your some advice would be for like people who are just just joining the industry, and how should they look up what they should fill themselves up with?
Sorry, it got a little bit cut.
Yeah, so I'm saying that fresh graduates who are just joining the industry, what do you think, what they should do, what inspiration they should look after, what they should, skill themselves with?
Yeah, I mean, I guess to sound like a little bit repetitive, I would suggest like look outside again of the design industry. Keep reading outside of the design industry. Like know what's happening in the world on the base, like economics, like geopolitics, and even the news and like what's happening these days. I think things like you need to be a responsible citizen. I know. Especially now in these times, I feel like we're sort of at like a little bit of a critical time in like world history where we need to both educate ourselves and the people around us into making the world more like a little bit equal and exercising our right to vote. And like, I mean, even like a simple thing like voting, right? Like you need to know who you need to vote for and why. So you need to follow like what people are doing and what are the histories behind it and everything. So I mean, this is not connected to design, but yes, of course, that results in you being a better informed person in general, and that'll help you in your careers. So widen your perspectives. I would just say like that's the little nugget, and keep practicing. Like there's stuff like new stuff will come along every year or something, like new tools and like new things, and like pick up stuff like filmmaking or like storytelling and stuff like that, which is not traditionally a part of design curriculum, especially like if you're doing, say, some sort of a UX course, or I don't know. But yeah, if you do stuff like that, just figure out how you can figure out your medium of choice for like talking about everything, talking about your own ideas, talking about your concepts, and talking about like the things that matter to you.
Mm-hmm. My final question, and that would be on gender equality. How do you think, like, how much responsibility we have as designers to, make the world equal in terms of, various things, but mostly on gender equality? What do you think? What are our responsibilities?
Yeah, I mean, like we have like a lot of responsibility on the gender side specifically. Like a story comes to mind where there was a book that I was reading about averages, and how back in the day airplane like seats used to be fixed, and they were made for like a certain like 5 feet, like some inches man, and women were not able to sit there and fly there because it was made. Basically, a lot of things are made for men. I think a lot of I was reading about like why a lot of doctors are trained on heart attack symptoms that are specific to men. So if a woman is having a heart attack, they won't even realize it because a woman's body reacts very differently to it. So these are the kind of things that happen when you don't have enough data on a certain section of society, right? Like because traditionally the average is like the average male and not like an average human being. So I think it's important for us to question like whenever like, oh, this is I mean, our offices are too cold, right? Like that is one of the things that's always my gripe. Like offices are optimized for the kind of temperature perception that men have. So it's also one of those things that needs to keep on changing. And it's not just gender. Like you need to take care of like race and like the socioeconomic problems as well, especially like where one facial recognition software ended up detecting a black man's face as like a baboon, which is like crazy, right? Like that shouldn't happen. So because it wasn't trained on the AI wasn't trained on like black faces. So it should have been, and those are the kind of oversights that we need to think about. Like we need to include everybody in like, especially in data sets and things like that, or in research, all sorts of users for us to be able to make something that is for everyone.
I think you did talk about that when you talked about reflections also, right? Countering our own biases as well. So you can see the world a little better that way.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting to look at, all the things that you put today for us. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today, Manasi. It was
really, thank you for having me.
Thank you. And here's a small token from our side.
Oh, thank you.
So we would like to confer upon you the title of Inspiring Young Designer.
Oh, thank you.
You for inspiring us today with your beautiful thoughts and inspiring thoughts. And as you yourself said, right, that inspiring group of people are the most, what was your
powerful force in the world? Yeah. They're the most powerful force in the world. Yeah.
Thank you for making us the most powerful folks by your inspiring talk. Thank you, Manasi.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye. Bye. Take care.